What is up, Coordination? On the pod today, we've got Joel Miller, who, along with his co-authors Glen, Weyl, and Richsen, published a paper in December 2022 entitled Beyond Collusion Resistance, Leveraging Social Information for Plural Funding and Voting. Basically, this is a quadratic funding episode. We are talking on this episode about how to make quadratic funding more Sybil resistant and more collusion resistant. So if you're a mechanism nerd like myself and you're into quadratic funding, this episode is for you. If you're not into mechanism design, then maybe this is an episode that you want to skip. But basically, I'm excited about this problem space because this paper explores pluralistic QF mechanisms that recognize the importance of social connections and incentivizing cooperation across social differences. So basically, this idea is that if you have a plurality of people who are diverse that like a public good, then that public good is more likely to be good. And we're exploring the inverse of that is collusion resistance. So basically, if people are colluding around a public good, how do you build a mechanism that is not fragile against that? So in this paper, Joel and his co-authors propose a new mechanism of quadratic funding that is collusion resistant, that is Sybil resistant, and is pro-plurality. And it's that mechanism that we talk about on this episode. I thought the paper was really meaningful and impactful, and I wanted to have Joel and GreenPilled to talk about that paper. Joel is a CS PhD student at the University of Illinois, Chicago, and does research at the intersection of computer science, economics, and social sciences, and has been working with Glen Weyl, the author of the quadratic funding paper. Well, actually, Glen and Zoe and Vitalik are the authors of the QF paper, but Joel has been working directly with Glen for the last couple of years. And this is just an exciting episode for me as a QF mechanism nerd and someone who's into plurality. So I think that if you are into QF, if you're into plurality, if you're into collusion resistance and fraud resistance, then this episode is for you. Without further ado, I give you Joel Miller.
HAIRDAO is here to route around the middlemen in biomedical research for hair loss. HAIRDAO is an open source investment and operating organization using the coordination tools of Ethereum to begin exploring the frontier of biomedical research that bureaucracy and middlemen have previously prevented. Did you know that 66% of men and 50% of women will experience hair loss in their lifetimes? HAIRDAO has already done some crazy cool science stuff, like their first research study on the impact of synthetic T3 and T4 thyroid hormones on the human scalp, and is also the second DAO ever to mint an IP NFT. So if you want to explore the frontier of the decentralized science movement, and maybe also you've lost your hair along the way, check out HAIRDAO at hairdao.xyz.
Hey Joel, what's up? How you doing?
I'm doing great. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, really excited to have you since I read the paper that y'all just published. You and Glen Weyl and Richsen published a paper in December 2022 entitled Beyond Collusion Resistance, Leveraging Social Information for Plural Funding and Voting. So take us down the rabbit hole. Why did you write this paper? Or co-write this paper, excuse me.
Sure, yeah. So I wrote this paper because I've been really interested in quadratic funding and quadratic voting ever since I read Glen's book, Radical Markets, a few years ago. And I became to get really interested in the Web3 space, and especially this idea of plurality. And essentially with Glen, working with him, last summer, we realized that there was a kind of big, well, I shouldn't say many people were involved, but I think I was a small part of this push to kind of realize that there was a way to push quadratic funding in a kind of more pluralistic and more democratic direction. Mm-hmm. The other thing that I got really excited about is, I'm in a computer science PhD program, and I do a lot of work at the kind of intersection of economics and computer science. And one economic assumption that keeps popping up that I'm not sure I fully agree with in all situations is this conception of economic agents as these kind of, almost like Hobbesian, very selfish types of people, right? And so the other thing that was really awesome about this work on quadratic funding is that to really see how to make quadratic funding better, you have to kind of get rid of that assumption and understand that in real life, people have friends, people collaborate, people look out for each other when they make decisions. And it's through understanding that you can kind of build a better quadratic funding mechanism.
Okay. Amazing. Well, I just want to bring the audience up to a common level of understanding. So let's do some base building before we get into what the paper is. So most of the audience probably knows this already, but what is quadratic funding?
Sure. So quadratic funding is an algorithm that takes in donations to some kind of public good. So this could be donations to build a park. It could be donations for an open source software project, of course. It could be donations to fund, health research that everybody can benefit from. So this mechanism is going to look at all these individual donations and then supplement them with some money from a matching pool. And then that amount of money will go to the project. That's the kind of nuts and bolts of quadratic funding. And the nice thing about it, compared to other ways of giving money to public projects, is that under some assumptions, it's essentially going to really nail the kind of optimal funding level, right? It's going to fund a project to the kind of exact level that society as a whole ought to be happy with.
Right. Yeah, I think the thing that Gitcoin's used in its marketing in the past is that it's the mathematically optimal way to democratically fund public goods. But maybe adding the bit about the assumptions would be a fair preamble to add. Could you enumerate what those assumptions are?
Totally. Yeah. So first off, I should say that in general, for any of these public goods, there's always going to be some limit to how much you should fund it. This is an assumption that we make in the paper, but I think it's really true in general, right? If you're, a community building a park, you want to, get the grass laid down, you want to put in some benches, right? But as you keep putting more and more money into the park, eventually it's like, okay, we've got, 50 rows of flowers and we're going to add another, 50. Like at some point, it's just not worth the extra money, right? So I want to be clear first off that you can kind of undershoot the funding level and you can overshoot the funding level, right? What quadratic funding is going to do is it's going to assume that the world is made up of these kind of very standard, rational, selfish economic agents, right? It's going to assume that they are kind of donating in line with their own individual rationality and individual selfishness, right? And then the great thing is that what the mechanism is going to do with all of that donation information is kind of say the following. It's going to say, okay, you guys are all selfish and isolated and you don't know each other. And you all donated these little amounts. But because I have all this extra information, I actually know that if you guys all knew each other super well and were all collaborating, then you wouldn't actually donate these tiny amounts. You would actually donate much more. And so the extra money that the mechanism gives is exactly that difference. It's exactly what is needed to kind of fill up the funding amount to the level that all of these individual agents would give if they could all perfectly collaborate with each other. Mm-hmm. So this is really the main assumption, aside from some kind of nitty-gritty assumptions about the way utility functions work, which we really don't need to get into. The kind of main one is this kind of isolation of the economic agents.
Right. So, I mean, I think as someone who's worked on quadratic funding during my time at Gitcoin, of course, I'm disaffiliated from leadership at Gitcoin, so I'm no longer there, but I have some domain knowledge from that. I know that Sybil attacks, which is basically one person pretending to be many people, because the mechanism optimizes for the preferences of the poor and the many. If you can make up identities, you can game the mechanism, is one layer of attack. And then collusion resistance, which is basically if these economic agents are colluding with each other, whether socially or by bribing each other to use their identity, then those are sort of attack vectors in the mechanism. And I don't know that I'm deep enough on the technical language here to know if what I'm saying is exactly the same as what you're saying, but it feels like collusion resistance and measuring the social distance between these actors is one way to sort of mitigate the attacks. And so when you talk about if these agents could perfectly communicate with each other, to me it feels like we're talking about collusion resistance. Am I close at all?
Oh, you're very close. Yeah, you're actually kind of right on the money. And I think I'm just using a different kind of language to express
Vernacular.
what I mean. So if it's all right, let me tell you a little bit more about these assumptions that this mechanism is making and how this idea of a Sybil attack or collusion can kind of challenge that.
Yep.
So, but I won't use those words. I'm going to try to use different terminology, maybe. So let's say, again, we've got a community deciding to build a park, right? Everybody in the community is isolated, and so they donate, right? The mechanism says, all right, I'll fill in the funding level to what you really ought to give. All right, so now what happens if actually we imagine that these people in the community, they partially know each other, right? Some people are neighbors here and there. They have some trust ties, right? So what's actually going to happen is when it comes to time to donate, these folks aren't going to act like totally isolated people. They're actually going to partially fill in some of that extra funding, right, that the mechanism was going to fill in the first place, right? Mm-hmm. They're going to kind of donate in this pro-social collaborative way. And then when the mechanism goes to look at everything, remember, the mechanism is still thinking of everybody as selfish and isolated. So what happens now is the mechanism is actually going to kind of overshoot the optimal funding level because there's some of that kind of collaboration money, quote unquote, that was already in there from the donations that the mechanism didn't realize. So how does this have to do with Sybil attacks or collusion? Well, I mean, it's just a matter of kind of how you think about the moral reality of what's happening, right? In a sense, a Sybil agent, who is, just to be super clear for all the listeners, a Sybil agent is a sock puppet account that's just controlled by somebody else. There's a certain sense in which that's not so different from, say, a couple who are married, right? So a Sybil agent and its owner are going to do the exact same thing. And we might expect, a married couple or a very tight family unit or a very tight, a pair of people in a friendship to actually behave in like a similar way, right? And so I think for me, one of the great things about this paper was the opportunity to kind of try to frame collusion resistance and Sybil resistance within this more general framework of just thinking about how people coordinate. Of course, Sybil resistance and collusion resistance are incredibly important for a Web3, based application like Gitcoin, right? Of course, you want to have a layer of just getting rid of the Sybils as much as you can, sniffing out collusion as much as you can. But I think on another level, the kind of more fundamental problem is just that the quadratic funding mechanism as it is unable to recognize when people are coordinating and unable to discount against that, right?
Yeah. I feel like what you said right there is like the nut graph, right? Right there is like the mechanism cannot figure out if you're colluding and therefore discount it. And so that sort of leads me into my next question, which is, what is this paper that you wrote? What is cluster mapping? What is the augmentation to the mechanism that y'all proposed in this paper?
Sure. So the first thing that we had to do actually when we wrote the paper was really nail down a solid definition of exactly what we meant by collusion resistance, right? So there's been a bunch of work on quadratic funding before, a bunch of examples of certain situations where colluding actors or Sybil actors can totally blow up the mechanism. But we wanted a kind of more general way of talking about it that could capture all of those cases, right? So the first thing that we did was to actually really try to specify that, right? The next step for us was to look at some of the previous papers that had been written. So there was a quite popular paper called Decentralized Society, Finding Web3 Soul that came out, I suppose, around this time last year, or maybe sometime in the spring of last year. So the appendix of that paper had some suggestions for collusion-resistant quadratic funding. So our first step was to just analyze those mechanisms under the kind of definition that we had made for collusion resistance. And it turned out that none of those mechanisms worked, But our job after that was easy, because it actually turns out that you could kind of combine two of the mechanisms that were in the appendix of that paper and actually get something that does work. And so that also hopefully will make it a little bit easier to explain our mechanism, if that's on the cards for today.
Yeah, let's pull that thread. I'd love to hear about this mechanism.
Sure. So, like I just said, I'll try to explain it by first explaining the two kind of simpler ones, and then maybe it'll be easy to see how they combine. So, in the first mechanism, the idea was to just try to compute some kind of measure of social distance between two people, right? Let's say, if people are, close friends and there's a bunch of transactions between them, or if we're running quadratic funding in a company and we know they're in the same department, there are plenty of different signals that you could try to use in different scenarios to understand social distance. So it turns out that you can actually look at the funding amount that quadratic funding gives and kind of break it up into little chunks. And each chunk actually corresponds to like a pair of people, right? And so what you can do if you have the social distance measure is say, okay, I'll get my quadratic funding kind of amount, I'll break it up into the chunks, and then for each chunk, I look at those two people, the associated two people, I see what their social distance is, and if their social distance is really high, I'm actually going to take that specific chunk of money and make it smaller, right? So I get the funding amount, I break it into chunks. For each chunk, I look at the associated pair, and if the pair is socially close, I make it smaller. And then I take all those chunks with the areas or the funding amounts that I've adjusted, and I add it back up and get my total funding amount, right? So that's mechanism one.
Yeah, so basically,
I
was going to summarize for the listener. So just like measuring the social distance between people is like a great way of seeing if they're coordinated. And, the example that I think Glen used when he explained this to me is that if we're going to run quadratic funding for Colorado, then if me and my wife and our friends in Boulder fund a public good in Boulder, then, maybe that's a different signal to the mechanism than if a public good in Denver is so good that we're funding it all the way from Boulder. So I don't know. Social distance for me is this abstract concept, but it's easier to ground it in geographic distance for me. It makes it more intuitive what it means to the mechanism by thinking about it in that way.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. So let's go on to the second mechanism.
Sure. So the second mechanism was based on a kind of similar idea. I would say that the second mechanism is instead of trying to understand social distance between each individual pair of people, it tries to understand the common groups that people are in, right? So pretty much what this second mechanism is going to do is it's going to have some list of social groups and a list of who is in each group, right? Then what it's going to do is essentially take individual donations, and it'll look at an individual and say, all right, if, you are in group A and group B, or let's say if you're in, the Denver, soccer league, and you're also in the Denver, homeowners association or something like that. What I'm actually going to do is I'm going to kind of funnel half of your money to a kind of proxy account that I've set up for the homeowners association, and half to a proxy account that I've set up for the soccer league, right? And I'll do that over all the people. And of course, other folks will also sometimes be in the soccer league or the homeowners association or plenty of other groups. And so as I do this, I'm going to have these proxy kind of accounts for each of the different social groups that exist in the world. They're going to get filled up with donations from the people in those groups. So once I've done all that, I have this funny situation where now I have a set of proxy accounts, each associated with like a cumulative donation. And now the idea finally is that I run quadratic funding, but treating the social groups as the entities that are donating instead of the agents, right? So in the end, it's quote unquote like the Denver Soccer League donated $100. if like there were a bunch of people in the soccer league that each donated some money, and then part of those donations filled up that $100 for the soccer league. And the great thing about that is that it's another way of trying to kind of discount for pre-existing coordination, in the sense that we ought to expect that everybody in the soccer league is more or less coordinated, because they all go play soccer games together. They talk about the shared projects that they might like, right? And so when it's time to donate, they are going to be somewhat coordinated. And this mechanism, by funneling all of that money into one or two or three places, is going to try to accommodate for that and understand that.
Yeah. So what I think is elegant here is that you're sort of measuring the social distance between the participants. And if the social distance is close enough, then you almost collapse them into one contributor. So we're in a way collapsing what collusion resistance and Sybil resistance is, to make the mechanism just anti-fragile against both. But because if people are close enough social distance wise to each other, then they're just treated as the same person from the benefit of the mechanism. It feels like an elegant way to not make the system completely Sybil and collusion resistance, because you can still obfuscate your social distance from each other, but to make it much more taxing on an attacker to build up a complicated social distance obfuscation layer whenever they want to collude. I'm trying to translate this into layman's terms, but not be too reductionist. Did I come close at all?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And I know that in reality, Sybil resistance is far more complicated than this. But to your point, you could imagine that if I spin up a Sybil account and I give it some amount of, Ethereum to donate, then this mechanism might say, okay, well, there are these two agents, and the only thing that the second agent has ever done is receive some Ethereum from this other guy. So actually, in a sense, maybe they're in the exact same group, right? And so, like you said, they get collapsed into just one agent at the end of the day.
Yeah. Well, that feels really elegant to me because, so one of the principles that I hold dearly in crypto economic systems is that they have to be cheaper to defend than to attack, right? This is the whole thing that's so elegant to me about proof of stake, is that I have to stake 32 ETH and I make incremental gains if I do something, if I secure the protocol, but if I attack the protocol, I can get slashed. Within one block, I can lose half my ETH. So it's cheaper to defend the system than it is to attack it. And I feel like what you're doing here with cluster mapping within quadratic funding is that you're making it much cheaper to defend because the mechanism itself is less fragile to Sybil and collusion attacks. But you also make it cheaper to attack the mechanism, because if I'm a Sybil attacker or a collusion attacker, not only do I have to make up all these new identities, but now I have to have them contribute to other grants to make it look like they're socially distanced from each other, which now I'm funding public goods as the cost of doing my collusion attack. And, there's just sort of like a tipping point where it just becomes not worth it to even attack the mechanism anymore. And so I think that it's elegant in that way, and it's probably even more powerful when it's paired with a privacy preserving Sybil resistance identity layer like Passport, Gitcoin Passport, in order to do that. So I think that it's elegant game theoretically.
Absolutely. Thank you. Yeah. As somebody who just keeps my nose in, math books for most of the time, I always try to be very humble about trying to understand the real world impact that any of this stuff could have. And obviously, there's some frontline kind of really basic Betty, or I shouldn't say basic Betty because I'm sure it's quite complicated, but there's some kind of frontline civil defense stuff that should probably always be in play. Things like Gitcoin Passport are always going to be awesome. And I think that, or my hope is that, this mechanism could just be an extra kind of layer, making the system work even better.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a link in the show notes to the paper if anyone wants to go read the paper that you authored with Glen Weyl and Leon Erickson on this. So you can read the paper. Is there anywhere that I can actually play with this yet? And are there any plans to build it out into a actual quadratic funding ecosystem soon?
Sure. Yeah. So actually, first off, before we get to that, I would love to explain the mechanism that we kind of created, because remember that it is like a combination of those other two, right?
Right. Let's go for it.
Sure. So And this will only take 5 seconds, and then I can get to your other question. So essentially, our only idea was to use this idea that the second mechanism had of funneling everybody's donations into proxy accounts associated with groups, but then to also leverage this idea of calculating social distance, but now understanding social distance as something between groups rather than between agents. So really just kind of took those two ideas, put them together, and it turns out that it works. Now, if you want to play around with this stuff, there's a few places you can. First off, I do have a GitHub project for it, which is hopefully we can put in the show notes. You can also play around with it at Radical Exchange. It is now online as the Radical Exchange Plural Voting tool. So you can run it with some friends or run it on your own and see what it'll do. And last of all, I'm actually about to write a Gitcoin community proposal, or rather submit a Gitcoin community proposal to see about implementing some of this stuff in the actual Gitcoin ecosystem, or rather at least kind of exploring how it could be implemented. I've been talking to Leon Erickson from Gitcoin, who is a collaborator on the paper, and Alex, who was previously on the fraud detection and defense team, as well as Kevin Olson, about putting this proposal together. And since all of the theoretical work is already done, I think there might be an opportunity to essentially just fine tune it and make sure that we can adapt the mechanism to Gitcoin's kind of unique needs and circumstances, right? You know, like when you're doing this math, you kind of have to be general because you don't know the situation the math is going to be used in, right? But in practice, there's a lot of fine tuning and optimization that you can do. And that's something else that I'm really excited to see about getting done.
Yeah. Very cool. So it sounds like this is a mechanism that if your proposal passes, you'll be able to play with soon on Gitcoin. And then it's also available on quadraticvote.radexchange.org. So for people to play with right now.
I think that's right. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I am really excited about this technique. You know, when I explain to people the magic of quadratic funding, they fall into one or two camps. They're like, oh, wow, that's really elegant. And then the adversarial thinkers will fall into this camp of, wait, what about Sybil attacks? And I've always kind of felt like Sybil attacks and collusion attacks are the Achilles heel of quadratic funding. Back when I was at Gitcoin, I spent a lot of time trying to come up with small brain identity mechanisms to prevent Sybil attacks, and now we have this one big brain mechanism that takes it and makes it anti-fragile against Sybil inclusion attacks. So I think it's really cool, and I really can't praise you enough for publishing this paper. But I gotta ask, as someone who's written a quadratic funding matching formula, how do you make this algorithm efficient to actually run? Because Gitcoin Grants was getting 500,000 contributions per quarter. And when you have an anti-collusion mechanism that scales O(n) squared, that's just algorithmic geek talk, by the way, for the non-technical listeners, to mean that the amount of computational cycles you have to spend scales exponentially based off of the number of like data points that you have. Like, is there going to be a way to build cluster mapping into something that has Gitcoin level scale? And are we going to use GPUs or parallel computing? Have you started to think a little bit about how you would implement this mechanism at scale yet?
Sure. So I'm hoping that in collaboration with folks at Gitcoin, we can figure something out. It is true that, if you have n people donating, you need to do around n squared steps, right, to compute all this stuff. And if n is big, n squared is even bigger, right? So I think that it depends. The scalability will depend on the use case. So, I mean, if you don't need to calculate the donation amount instantly, I think that, sure, maybe it's okay to have a cluster of GPUs spending some time working on the problem. And by the way, of course, at the end of the day, n squared isn't like 2 to the n or some of these other, functions that mathematicians like myself get really scared of, right?
Right.
So I think that, it will be a while before, your smartwatch can do quadratic funding in, a millisecond. But I am still hopeful that for processes where where a really quick result isn't paramount, there will be a way to make it work.
Yeah. Very cool. Well, that was a niche question only for the 5 people in the audience that have ever implemented quadratic funding and had performance issues with it. But I figured we had to get it out there just because of my domain knowledge with QF. And I also think that, if we want to scale QF out to the world, then finding an algorithmically efficiently way of doing it and having it still be collusion resistance will be really important. So, we will keep an eye out for that GCP, and then the audience can go to quadraticvote.radexchange.org, and that seems like that's how they can play with cluster mapping. Is there anything I didn't ask about the paper that you want to tell us?
I think we pretty much covered it. I would just encourage everybody the next time they read an economics paper. Well, not that people are going and doing that every day, but the next time you hear people talk about economics, maybe, just remember that the assumptions that people make about selfishness and quote unquote individual rationality, they might not always hold up in every case. And at least for quadratic funding, understanding exactly where and when they applied was really the key to kind of breaking through to a better mechanism. So, I would just encourage everybody to be a little bit cautious about some of the more dogmatic stuff that economists say.
Yeah, really a great point. I'm wondering if you can maybe sing me a song about pluralism. I know that we talked about creating more plural funding and voting, and I think it'd be a really sweet place to end the episode talking about why pluralism, what pluralism means to you, and why you sort of fell in love with this value set. So why plural QF? Why should I want more plural QF?
Sure. Yeah. I think that in general, it's awesome when we can support things that diverse groups of people like. That's really the long and short of it. To tell you about why I got into plurality in the first place, it's because I used to spend a lot of time volunteering with mutual aid networks. Mutual aid networks, for people who haven't heard or maybe don't know about them, are essentially like, plural organizations in meat space, right? So they're decentralized. They really prioritize collaboration across differences. And I saw how incredible those types of mechanisms, I guess now by mechanism, I mean like real world, activities could be. So, any kind of opportunity to make the digital space more pluralistic, I think is really awesome. At the end of the day, the fact that a diverse group of people like a project, it's really a signal about the potential utility that project could bring to the world, right? It's not just some kind of, let's all walk hand in hand, down the boulevard or something like that type of speak. There really is like a kind of an economic reason to want those types of projects to succeed. And so, I'm just happy to be a part of the story of bringing that type of stuff into the digital world.
Right. So this is all about making pluralism practical, and it feels like the value set is that there's an economic reason that if a diverse group of actors like a public good, then that public good must be good. Whereas if this public good only caters to a monolithic block of people who are closely clustered in social distance, then maybe it's closer to a private good or a common good or something than something that's broadly appreciated by people across social distance, would be my restating of what you said there.
Definitely. Yeah.
It's interesting to see this meme of plurality come out of the Radical Exchange group. And, I got a sticker at, I think it was DevCon Bogota. No, it was Shelling Point Bogota. And the sticker said infinite diversity and infinite combinations, which I think is originally a Star Trek thing. But I thought it was cool to see the meme back with Rad Exchange.
Was it for
this? Our video? Yeah. So for our video audio listeners, Joel's hanging up or showing a sticker that says infinite diversity and infinite combinations. It's sort of neat to see Radical Exchange as an institution put forward this meme of plurality, and now there's the Plurality in Action network, and then the Plurality Conference and all that kind of stuff. So supporting the meme and the value set of plurality with mechanisms that brings that plurality into practice, it feels like it's becoming more of a movement now, and I just think that that's cool.
I agree. I think it's awesome.
Yeah. Well, is there anything I didn't ask that you want to say just in general?
Go out and talk to people. I think that's the message I have. I think for me, actually, the really the biggest benefit of the kind of plurality mindset as a whole, aside from, the whatever proof you can write about the quadratic funding amount and how that might maximize some welfare function or, whatever, that's all, details. Mm-hmm. On the whole, the really great thing about plurality to me is that it fundamentally kind of encourages people to break through what I see as a lot of kind of alienation that capitalism and other factors of the modern world have more or less imposed on us, right? To me, plurality is about saying, hey, if we create these really kind of strong links of trust, and we all have the ability to cooperate and communicate, then the space of problems that we can solve is going to drastically open up, right? Mm-hmm. And so part of that could be, participating in funding rounds for public goods, but part of that kind of same plurality mindset could also just be trying to, to form new links with people in your real world communities, right? Yeah. And so look, I'm a computer scientist. I know how scary it is to talk to people, right? Of course, don't worry. I know, I've been there, but trust me, and maybe you don't need me to tell you this, but it can be really, really rewarding to form those new links. And I think if that's happening in real life or in the digital world, either way, it's awesome. So, yeah.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I think it's a good argument to get away from the routine and to push your boundaries, because if you can commune with people who are unlike you, then I think that you're kind of getting that cooperation across social distance, not in a mechanism deeply on the internet, but in your social life. If you can introduce some entropy and just by talking to people, then there's a lot to be gained there. So I think it's wise words.
Thank you. Yeah.
Well, this has been a fun episode. I think cluster mapping is an incredibly powerful mechanism. As someone who's written QF before, I'm curious to see how the next people who implement it make it scale. But I'm also excited about just mechanisms that are easier to defend than to attack. And so thank you for your contribution to the public good of creating better public goods mechanisms. And there's a link in the show notes for the listeners who want to read the paper. So thanks so much for coming on, Joel.
Awesome. This was a blast. Thank you so much for having me.
You bet. Peace and love.